Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and I am here to bring you the update to Golgari Midrange, to my centralized stock list with Throne of Eldraine cards. So, of course, I am recording this several days before the cards are available on MTGO, so I just thought to use Tapped Out as a pretty clean, pretty coherent way to present the deck as a whole. So, we're going to talk about the changes, why we made them, of course, go line by line. You will note, however, only 14 sideboard cards, so I am enlisting your aid, my friends, for the final slot. The viewership will help decide what the final sideboard slot should be. We have some maybe board options that I'll present, but of course, feel free to make other suggestions. There are dozens and dozens, of course, of playable cards that could go in that slot, so let me know as I go through this what you think that final sideboard slot should be, but also what you think about the deck as a whole. So thank you in advance for your feedback, thank you in advance for watching, and thank you, of course, as always, to all Patreon supporters who do make this content possible. So, without further ado, let's talk about the deck. Okay, so any good deck is laid upon the foundations of the land base, right? And we gotta start there. So we are on 24 lands, and regular viewers of the channel will note that I have been on 23 for quite some time now. This was during Hogak Summer, and even afterwards. The format was really fast, really linear, we needed to be really low curve, and we needed a high density of interaction. Now, the final point is still true, but these days, the format is slower, and it is grindier, so we need to adjust accordingly. The lower curve stuff is still fine, but we also need to be able to take things into the late game on a more regular basis and keep pace with some of the really grindy Stoneforge Mystic decks, the decks like Jund, the Grixis control style decks, the piles of value that come out to play when the format slows down, right? So 24 lands might seem a little incongruous at first because it means, by definition, we have one fewer spell in the deck. We are a little bit less spell dense than we used to be. So why have we moved to 24 lands? Well, the first reason is because we are playing the card Questing Beast. I did talk about this at length in the Questing Beast Will It Rock video, by the way. Yes, it will rock, at least I believe it will. And we've got 2 copies. That's how excited I am about this guy. So definitely a really, really cool card. But this is the first time in a while that I've been on multiple 4-drops main deck. It's been either 0 or 1 for the recent past. And that in and of itself is a pretty decent reason to move to 24 lands. Another major reason I've moved to 24 lands is because I believe that right now and going forward for the foreseeable future, of course, anything can happen with other new printings changing the meta, but right now and for the foreseeable future, I believe that we should be on the rock leaning more heavily into creatures as ways to grind out games, because it seems like if Questing Beast is going to perform as well as we hope it will, Questing Beast, Hexdrinker, Tireless Tracker, cards like this seem better positioned to me to grind out games against Stoneforge Mystic, against Jund, against Grixis, than cards like Liliana the Last Hope and Vraska Golgari Queen, the Planeswalkers, in other words, with a notable exception of Liliana of the Veil, who's very, very good right now. The Planeswalkers are still playable, they're still fine. Nissa Vital Force we can add to that list as well, but in my view they are not as well positioned as they were a little while ago, because look, those cards like Last Hope and Vraska, they're great, but against Jund, if you take them down for the guaranteed value, they are then vulnerable to a Wrenn and 6 ping. And against control decks, you don't necessarily have to hope to match them Planeswalker for Planeswalker to keep up with the ability to draw cards off of Tracker, to blow out their removal with Hexdrinker at level 4 or eventually level 8, or just to answer them with Questing Beast and answer their Planeswalkers immediately. So in other words, we have more ways to be proactive and end the game while also accruing advantage along the way than we used to, and our ways to have more static value pieces like Planeswalkers that realistically don't usually ult, although of course that can happen. More realistically, the Planeswalkers activate several times and and get a really good advantage for you rather than being single-handed win conditions. It just seems more likely to lean into the creatures as a successful strategy than to lean in the planeswalkers for the aforementioned reasons. So if we are playing more 4-drops and more mana sinks, Hexdrinker and Tireless Tracker are both way more mana hungry than Liliana the Last Hope and Vraska, for example, then that's just another reason to be on 24 lands. The final reason to be on 24 lands is, of course, Castle Locthwain. So this card fits seamlessly into the land base that we were already playing, the other 23 lands being identical to what you've seen on this channel recently, but only if you make it the 24th land. If you make it the 23rd land, then suddenly you have the question of what to cut. But if you make it the 24th land, then look, it becomes our 18th black source, which is the golden number. That's the number we are targeting for optimal black production without reaching diminishing returns. If you go 19, 20, excuse me, that's fine, but you're reaching diminishing returns. If you go 17, 16, you're starting to not as consistently as you should cast Lily of the Veil on curve. But 24 lands, 18 black sources, this is kind of the golden number. This is kind of the golden ratio. And Castle Locthwain, is also a little bit black hungry in its own right because, of course, you need 2 other black sources to activate it, right? So I don't necessarily think it's correct to skimp on other black sources just because the castle can produce black. In fact, I'm glad that it can because it just means we've got 18 black sources. So otherwise, the land base is just as we've seen. If you do want to get a little bit greedier with the color production, you could turn this 1 Quagmire into a second Treetop Village. And look, playing only 17 black sources is not the end of the world. But in my view, we might as well aim for consistency. We've got a ton of utility with Urborg, 1 Treetop, 2 Peatland still, let's not forget that great card, 1 Quagmire, 3 Field of Ruin, and of course 1 Castle Locthwain. So I'm very, very happy with this mana base. Looks really clean, really powerful to me. So let's skip over the creatures for a moment, my friends, and talk about the other non-creature spells. This is all core, it is all stock relative to what I feel is optimal. So for Liliana the Veil, 3/3 split on Inquisition and Thoughtseize, 3 Assassin's Trophy, 4 Fatal Push, and then 1 each of Decay, Pulse, and Brutality. I think this is the optimal baseline for your non-creature spells. I think you have to have a very good reason to play any fewer than the numbers that you've seen, that you see of each one of these spells. Now, the one thing that's missing here is in the recent past, with the format more linear, I have opted to play 1 extra copy of something, whether it be a 4th Inquisition or a 2nd Abrupt Decay. These are both cards that I have registered in the recent past. A little bit before that, you would see me play a 5th Planeswalker, usually Liliana the Last Hope or Vraska Golgari Queen. These are all valid options, but as mentioned, I think our mana sinks are going to be very well positioned, which is why we've got a little bit higher of a threat density and a creature count than we used to. But we're not really doing it at the expense of our sorceries, our instants, our planeswalkers, and as the post-Eldraine meta unfolds, it will become clearer, if we need to add that 4th Inquisition back, or that 2nd Decay back, or a 4th Trophy, or a 5th Planeswalker, anything like that. If and when that becomes apparent, we can lean into the creatures, but for this, we can lean a little bit less into the creatures and a little bit more into the interaction. I'll be happy to make that change. But for now, when the meta goes into flux, I almost feel like it's kind of like the people who play Burn when the meta is in flux. You just want to do the proactive thing. And right now, we're just going to do the proactive thing and play lots of creatures. So let's talk about that. Okay, so we do have a creature count of 16. It is on the high end of average, but it is still within the realm of normalcy for sure. Let's go line by line. We got 3 copies of Bob. Now, I think playing 4 is perfectly valid. I would never look at anyone's list right now and be like, oh, why are you on the 4th Bob? That doesn't seem right. But I like hedging down to 3 while Burn is prominent, and while Plague Engineer is seeing so much play, and while Jund is a major deck to beat with Wrenn and 6, there's just still a lot of Predators for Dark Confidant, unfortunately, and even though he's still one of our best cards, I do think we don't lose that much by dropping the 4th. Even when he's at his best, he does tend to be clunky and less than desirable in multiples unless he's getting removed, right? So only 3 Bob, that's why we're doing that. Hexdrinker, look, you know, this card might still be optimal as a one-of, because talk about clunky in multiples, right? But it does give our deck a dimension that no other card does. Yes, sometimes it just gets blown up by a Wrenn and 6. Sometimes it's just very clunky. Sometimes you invest the mana into it and they have removal right before it becomes level 3. Sometimes you make it level 6 and then they bounce it or kill it with a sorcery or a sweeper. It can be really clunky, but it also breaks through board stalls that are otherwise unbreakable. We've seen this happen a few times recently on the channel. It is a respectable way to race, even as a Savannah Lions, because remember, we are disrupting. Sometimes we don't have the ability to, we don't have the luxury, though, to play a 2-drop, because we have to disrupt every single turn beginning turn 2. So if you can go turn 1 Hexdrinker, turn 2, you know, discard into tapped land or Brutality for discard, turn 3 Liliana, some way to disrupt like that, you've hit them twice with Hexdrinker in that time frame, and then maybe you untap and make it level 4 if you have a good window to do so, right? So definitely very, very helpful to race, and again, a card who gets better when we are on a slightly higher land count. Questing Beast, as mentioned, I have an entire video dedicated to this. If you haven't seen it and you're a little skeptical about that card, please check that out. I make the case for the Questing Beast that it will rock there, but I'm very, very excited about this card. It's going to be a really feel-good one, I think, and very, very effective as well. We'll see, maybe 2 is a little aggressive, maybe eventually we pare back down to 1, but if we're going to test it, let's play 2. Scooz, talk about mana sinks. This is a classic standby mana sink for the deck. It just gives us that little extra bit of ability to compete against strategies like Burn, like Hyper Aggro, like Dredge in Game 1. If they have a medium start, and we have a medium start with any of those decks, but our medium start also involves like a turn 4 Scooz with the mana to make it good, yeah, we're probably favored because Scooz just disrupts that well and really can take over the game. So yet another card that does benefit from the 24th land being involved. Even though the 24th land is another black land, it still can help us do other things while casting Scooz and activating Scooz, right? 4 copies of Tarmogoyf, non-negotiable. Just play 4 Goyf. Just accept that Goyf is that good. We just need 4 of them, unless you're on a budget build. And even if you are on a budget build, make Goyf a big priority for the first cards to acquire. Finally, and perhaps the card I'm least sold on playing 2 copies of main deck is Tireless Tracker, but look, the card has also performed very well for me lately. It's another card that benefits from us being on 24 lands, and even though some people say, look, this card is just too slow for Modern, or it's just not really a mid-range card, it's like a big mana value sideboard card, I continue to believe that this is a very proactive thing for us to do, because we do take the games long enough where Tracker becomes really relevant. It's a threat, and it accrues advantage. Those are 2 very, very core things that we need to do. Having them both in 1 card, well, that's just a dream. So 2 copies of Tireless Tracker, you know, maybe we'll need to speed up the deck a little bit in the near future, and maybe we'll look at trimming away 1 or 2 of the slower cards, and we'd be at least looking at Tracker in that case. But given the context of the rest of the 60, I think 2 Tracker is actually going to be really, really good here. So there's the main deck, my friends. Let me know what you think, and now let's talk about the side. Okay, so the ratios in our sideboard, I think, feel pretty good. They feel pretty sweet. We've got a few 3-ofs and then a bunch of 1-ofs. Kind of feels cool, right? But the first 3 of it is, of course, the Plague Engineer. If you don't know why I like this card, watch literally any other video I've ever made, because I rarely let a video go by without ranting and raving about how good the Plague Man is, right? So 3 Plague Man, notably no longer 4, which I was on for a long, long time, 1 main deck, 3 side. We don't have the main deck 1 anymore. We're just, again, leaning a little bit more into the mana sinks, whereas Plague Engineer, when our curve was a little bit lower, was kind of more of a standalone threat, where you play the 3 mana at the top of your curve, and then you go back to doing other lower curve things the following turns. With the 24 land build, I think Plague Engineer's stock falls a little bit relative to things we talked about in the main deck. So only 3, but still one of our very best cards, if you ask me. 3 Collector Ouphe. Now, if I was being led around by the nose by my own anecdotal experience, I would play no Ouphe, which I have registered lists for leagues on this channel with no Ouphe before, because I personally I just keep dodging Urza. I've just never played against a Urza in a league, still. And I've probably played over 150 leagues since Modern Horizons came out. But still have yet to face Urza, but obviously I know it's out there. It's a very prominent deck in the meta. Of course, Tron affinity variants never go away. And then there's always those rogue artifact brews. Lots of brew decks end up leveraging a good amount of artifacts, so 3 copies of Collector Ouphe feels great to me right now. But if the artifact-based decks, where a Stony Silence on legs is good, do tend to fall off, I'll be happy to move back down to 1 or 2, but right now, 3 seems pretty good to me. Of course, 3 Fulminator Mage has been stock ever since I've been on this channel for my lists. However, and it still feels great, big mana's still big, no pun intended, control is still big. Non-Ren 6 mid-range decks, Fulminator is definitely a good role player against Burn, Infect, Affinity. But I do wonder, my friends, if Fulminator is just slowly but steadily become a little bit worse positioned anyway than it once was. The reasons for this are as follows. Number 1, I mentioned big mana. Of course, he's still just about our best card there, but they play Veil of Summer now in Tron and in Valakut a lot of the time. And that's definitely a beating. That's definitely a real beating. Makes Fulminator a lot worse if they manage to line up Veil against him. Number 2, I mentioned Control. And while he's still very good there, and I still don't like teching against Control, so it's nice to have lots of Fulminators to bring in there when I don't have the dedicated Control hate. A lot of Control decks are playing Stoneforge Mystic now, and Fulminator feels less impactful there. I don't know if that's scientific, but it feels less impactful than against a more traditional Control deck. And finally, a lot of mid-range decks, even non-Jund ones that happen to play Red-Green X, are packing Ren 6, and of course against Ren 6, Fulminator looks very, very porous. So I do just wonder if we end up needing slots. Feels a little blasphemous to even suggest, right? But maybe paring down a Fulminator just doesn't feel quite as good as it used to, and notably we don't have Unearth in the main deck or in the sideboard anymore, so there's that synergy that Fulminator no longer has, where Fulminator and Unearth is a very powerful synergy, right? So just food for thought, but for now I do still have 3. Let me know what you think. Moving on to the one-of, speaking of things that are good against big mana, well, Ashiok is a great way to diversify our hate. Ashiok hoses Valakut, very good against Amulet Titan, very good against Tron, and even pretty good against Stoneforge Mystic decks. I don't like seeing Ashiok in just like a regular mid-range mirror. Again, I would never bring an Ashiok against a rock mirror, unless I didn't have enough other cards to bring in. But if you're looking at like an Abzan Stoneblade or a Dead Gael Stoneblade deck, now you're talking, because now you can hose their fetches, which is okay, but not enough of a reason to bring in a card that doesn't come down till turn 3 on its own. But you're also hosing Stoneforge Mystic Search, and you're also able to attack the graveyard when they're playing Lingering Souls, which is a clear and pressing danger that you do need to deal with. So, Ashiok definitely has a lot of really good use cases right now, and the graveyard decks are a lot less explosive, so just as another graveyard hate piece, Ashiok is very valid. I am high on this card. The second Collective Brutality, you'll note that there's not actually all that much help for removal for like small creature decks in the sideboard besides Plague Man. So Brutality shoring up that matchup, those matchups, is good. Brutality obviously helping against combo and control and some big mana decks, and of course being another slam dunk against Burn. Gotta love it. Definitely like playing 2 right now. Speaking of good against Burn and against small creature decks and against graveyards, we've got good old Kalitas, who is another 4-drop and another mana sink, who does definitely thrive a little bit more when we are on 24 lands like this. So Kalitas, an all-star of the deck, and Then we have a Nihil Spellbomb and a Surgical Extraction rounding things out. Of course, I would like to make room for a little bit more of the lower curve, hard graveyard hate like these cards. You can never really have too much, even if graveyard decks are at a low ebb. We'll talk about that in the maybe board section coming right up, but for now, much like these 8 sorceries, 8 instants, and 4 planeswalkers, I think the 1 spellbomb and the 1 extraction is a baseline that you should not really ever leave home without, but maybe, if the meta calls for it, and or if it's just the safe thing to do, we could play another copy or 2 of these effects. But that is the 74, my friends. Let me know what you think, and now let's talk about what could make that 75th slot. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, of course, there are dozens of cards that could feasibly see play. We're a black-green mid-range deck where you can make a case for any number of cards, but these are kind of the 5 that are on my short list. But if you want to make a strong case for another card, my friends, please let me know. But let's begin with what I've got here. Of course, the second Spellbomb, you can never really go wrong with. It's definitely the safe thing to do. We do have the ability to bring this in against Control, against Jund, against Lingering Souls decks, and having both copies be really, really desirable. So this is kind of the boring but safe option, if you will. But other options here are Duress. Now, I do really like having the 7th discard spell in the 75, the 7th 1-mana discard spell to be exact, because we're not really counting Collective Brutality there. And Duress is, if you've got one in the sideboard, I think it should be Duress, because it is going to be not dead. It's going to be good in the matchups where you want it, and you don't bring it in when it's not. That's kind of the definition of a sideboard card, right? So can't really go wrong with the Duress. You just don't always have room for it. Moving on, Liliana's Triumph, I continue to believe, has been underrated by the community as a whole, and given the aforementioned lack of spot removal, like, look, there was a time on this channel, granted it was the pre-Plague Man time, but where you would see me playing a second Maelstrom Pulse, and a Death Mark, and an Engineered Explosives, and a Damnation. Maybe not all 4, but certainly at least 3 of those 4, most of the time in my sideboards. It just felt good to have a big pile of removal to bring in. You know, you trim away at the edges, like cut a Lily of the Veil, cut a couple discard spells against these like Ether Vial decks, and maybe trim a Bob if you're on 4, and trim a little here, a little there, and then you've got a big pile of removal, and those matchups feel so favored. And the removal is so diverse that you have, you know, the Damnation for Eldrazi decks, and you have EE for Bogles, and, you know, stuff like that. So, but notably, we don't have much of that going on. We just kind of have Kalitas, who's good in those matchups, but who doesn't interact on his own. We have Brutality, which gets outsized kind of quickly by a good number of those decks, but is still good enough to play. And then, of course, Plague Man, who is a complete hoser, but it is definitely still appealing to have more removal. With humans on the downswing, I don't think it should be Deathmark, and EE is definitely an option, but so is Liliana's Triumph, because it does have game against the Eldrazi decks. It does really, really hose Bogles badly. It definitely can make up the numbers and be decent, even against go-wide decks, because we have so many other ways to stop them from going really, really wide, that Triumph is just serviceable removal. And, you know, this card is surprisingly applicable against a wide variety of matchups. So that's another one that's been kind of in and out of my list, but definitely viable. And look, even though I made the case for creatures being a little bit better positioned on the whole than planeswalkers for us in those value slots, you still can't go wrong with a Lily the Last Hope. She's still very, very good for us, so we could just play a Lily the Last Hope, and that would be totally fine in the 15th slot. But finally, the Murderous Rider must be under consideration. I'm still kind of high on this card, to be honest. Now, admittedly, less high on it than I was when it first came out, because if I'm remembering correctly, this came out one morning during spoilers, and I was like, oh man, this is actually really cool. We can finally trade at parity with Planeswalkers, because the Planeswalker comes down and gets it into activation, and then if you trophy or pulse or decay it, or play Hero's Downfall on it, which this is a close comparison to, they still came out ahead on resources due to that activation. But Murderous Rider, yes, we have to pay the life, but hey, you get to 2 for 2 them, because you get to trade Swift End for the Planeswalker, and then later on you get to play the Rider, right? So definitely felt appealing, and then Questing Beast got spoiled, and then that's the real exciting way, the real, like, hyper-powerful way to answer Planeswalkers at parity. But, as mentioned, we don't necessarily have as much spot removal for creatures or for Planeswalkers as we would like in our sideboard. Murderous Rider can do that. Murderous Rider is just another 2-for-1 to bring in mid-range and control matchups. And Murderous Rider is something that is definitely decent against burn, even though most of the time you'll just play it as a 2-3 lifelink for 3. Not a modern playable card, but definitely playable against burn. And burn is still a major deck to beat, but we have the problem of not being able to dedicate too many slots to specific anti-burn tech, really any slots to exclusively anti-burn tech, because it's just too narrow. It's just too narrow. Like, the pure life gain cards are just not worth a slot in our deck, really. So Murderous Rider, just having that incidental, like, oh, this is pretty good against burn, definitely does not hurt. So if it's kind of a wash, maybe we'll just play the Murderous Rider just to test out the new tech, right? But, of course, my friends, your decisions will help inform my decision here, so let me know what you think. Okay, so that was our deck tech. I hope you liked it. I do get a lot of really good feedback about the deck techs and the theory crafting videos. I suspect that some people actually enjoy them more than they enjoy the gameplay vids, which is surprising to me, but I love it. I love that you love it, and I hope this was no exception. I know that as mid-range players, we do accept our fate. As our work is never done, we should always be re-examining our lists, making little tweaks here and there. Not change for the sake of change. That's a logical fallacy, but always trying to keep up with what our opponents are likely to be up to, and always trying to find the optimal 75. And I'm doing my best to help you do that, and to help myself as well along the way. But no one can do it alone, so let me know what you think. I look forward, as always, to reading your feedback, to reading your comments, and thanks once again for watching. Stay tuned to the channel, because we will, once these cards are legal, be playing a list very much like this through some leagues on the channel for you, in addition to what else we've been doing, dabbling in other archetypes a little bit here and there, and continuing to do the theory crafting and the deck teching. So thanks again, stay tuned, and I will talk to you soon. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.